The water is cold against your skin as you stand waist-deep in the Pacific Ocean. The sun hanging low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. Behind you, the beach stretches away into the distance, footprints already being erased by the tide. Ahead of you, nothing but endless blue, the surface rippling with light, hiding everything beneath. You've stood here 1,000 times before, always stopping at this invisible boundary, this line between the world you know and the world you can only visit for a few stolen minutes before your lungs scream for air. But today is different. Today, you take a breath, a deep one that fills your chest completely, and you don't stop walking. The water rises to your shoulders, your neck, your chin. You close your eyes as it covers your face, and then something extraordinary happens. Nothing. No panic, no burning in your lungs, no desperate need to surface. You open your eyes underwater, and you breathe. The ocean fills your lungs the way air always has, and in this single, impossible moment, everything you thought you knew about being human dissolves into the blue around you. This is where our story begins. In a world where the ocean is no longer a place we visit, but a place we belong. For 300 million years, our ancestors made a choice, though they didn't know it at the time. They were fish, simple creatures with gills that pulled oxygen from water as naturally as you're pulling oxygen from air right now. But then something changed. Some of those ancient fish began spending time in shallow water, in tide pools that would occasionally dry up, in environments where gills alone weren't enough. They developed a primitive lung, a simple sac that could gulp air when water failed them. Over millions of years, those lungs became more sophisticated, more efficient, until an entire lineage of creatures left the water completely and colonized the land. We are the descendants of those pioneers, land animals who conquered deserts and mountains and frozen tundra, who built civilizations that span continents. But in becoming creatures of the air, we closed a door behind us. The ocean, which covers 71% of Earth's surface and contains 99% of the living space on our planet, became fundamentally inaccessible to us except as visitors holding our breath or hiding inside metal vessels. We evolved away from the water so completely that returning to it, truly returning to it, became biologically impossible. Until now. Until we imagine a world where evolution or technology or some combination of both has given us back what we lost, has made us amphibious in the truest sense, creatures who can breathe both air and water with equal ease. The biology of this transformation would be nothing short of miraculous. Your lungs right now are optimized for extracting oxygen from gas, from the mixture of nitrogen and oxygen and trace elements that makes up the atmosphere. The alveoli in your lungs, those tiny sacs where oxygen transfers into your bloodstream, are incredibly thin and delicate, designed to maximize surface area while remaining light enough that breathing doesn't exhaust you. They work beautifully in air, but plunge them into water, and they would collapse, unable to extract the dissolved oxygen efficiently enough to keep you alive. Fish solve this problem with gills, structures that work on a completely different principle. Water flows across thin filaments packed with blood vessels, and through a process called countercurrent exchange, oxygen diffuses from the water into the blood with remarkable efficiency. But gills have their own limitations. They need a constant flow of water across them to work, which is why fish are always moving or always positioned in currents. They also extract oxygen much more slowly than lungs do from air, which is why fish are generally less metabolically active than mammals of similar size. For a human to breathe underwater, we would need something revolutionary, perhaps a hybrid organ that combines the best features of both gills and lungs, capable of extracting oxygen from water when submerged and from air when on land, switching between modes as seamlessly as you switch between walking and swimming. Imagine the first generation of humans born with this ability, children who learn to breathe water in the same gradual way that babies learn to breathe air when they're born. Perhaps it's terrifying at first, that moment when a child takes their first underwater breath and every instinct screams that they're drowning, until their modified respiratory system kicks in and they realize they're perfectly safe. Or perhaps it's natural, instinctive, a capability that feels as innate as blinking or swallowing. These children would grow up in a world fundamentally different from anything humanity has ever known. They would spend their early years exploring tide pools and shallow reefs the way previous generations explored backyards and parks. Their spatial reasoning would develop in 3 dimensions from the start, understanding up and down as equally valid directions for travel, not the afterthought it is for land-dwelling humans who spend most of their lives on a 2-dimensional surface. The psychological implications alone would reshape human development in ways we can barely comprehend. Fear of water, that ancient anxiety that keeps most humans cautious around the ocean, would vanish entirely. The sea would become as familiar and non-threatening as the air, just another medium to move through, another environment to inhabit and explore and make home. The cities we would build in this new amphibious world would look like something from a fever dream, structures that defy everything we know about architecture and urban planning. Picture this. You're approaching New Seattle from the south, and the city sprawls before you in layers. The surface layer looks almost familiar. Skyscrapers and bridges and the infrastructure of a modern metropolis. But as your perspective shifts, you realize that every building continues downward, extending 50, 100, 200 feet below the waterline. The city doesn't stop at the ocean's surface. It treats that boundary as arbitrary, irrelevant. Towers rise from the seabed like glowing monuments, their lights visible from miles away in the clear water. Between the buildings, instead of streets, there are currents, carefully engineered flows of water that people ride like invisible highways, swimming effortlessly from one district to another. The architecture itself would be revolutionary, taking advantage of water's unique properties. Buildings wouldn't need to support their own weight in the same way land structures do, allowing for designs that are more organic, more fluid, spiraling and curving in ways that would collapse under their own mass in air, but remain perfectly stable in water. Glass would dominate, because in this world, the view is everything. The marine environment itself becoming part of the design aesthetic. Every home, every office, every public space would have windows looking out onto the ocean, watching the endless ballet of marine life that now shares our cities. Transportation would undergo a transformation so complete that future generations would struggle to understand how we lived before. The morning commute in amphibious human civilization wouldn't involve cars or trains or buses. You would simply swim, launching yourself from your apartment balcony and propelling yourself through the water with powerful kicks, your body adapted over generations to be more hydrodynamic, more efficient in the water. Some people would use mechanical aids, small propulsion devices strapped to their backs that multiply their speed, but many would prefer the pure simplicity of swimming, the meditative quality of moving through water under your own power. Traffic patterns would shift from 2 dimensions to 3, with designated depth levels for different speeds and directions, preventing the chaos that would otherwise result from millions of people moving freely through 3-dimensional space. Imagine the freedom of it, never being stuck in gridlock, never waiting for a train, simply diving down to your preferred depth and swimming toward your destination, adjusting your route in real time to avoid congestion or to take a scenic path through a kelp forest or past a coral restoration project. The concept of rush hour would still exist, but it would feel entirely different when you have the whole water column to work with, when you can simply swim higher or lower to find clear space. Food production in this new world would become something almost unrecognizable compared to the agriculture and fishing industries of our current reality. We wouldn't be fishing anymore, not in the traditional sense of catching wild animals. We would be farming the ocean with the same intensity and sophistication that we farm land today, but with yields that dwarf anything terrestrial agriculture can produce. Kelp forests would be cultivated in massive underwater plantations, these incredibly fast-growing organisms providing not just food, but raw materials for construction, biofuels, pharmaceuticals, and thousands of other products. The kelp farmers would swim through their crops daily, monitoring growth, removing diseased plants, optimizing the spacing and depth to maximize photosynthesis. Fish farming would become fish ranching, with enormous open water enclosures where salmon, tuna, and hundreds of other species would be raised in conditions far closer to their natural environment than the cramped net pens of today. The ranchers would live among their herds, understanding fish behavior with an intimacy impossible for surface-dwelling humans, knowing individual animals, guiding migrations, protecting the young from predators. Protein scarcity would become a historical curiosity as humanity taps into the ocean's tremendous productivity. The ocean produces biomass far more efficiently than land does, and with direct access to that productivity, we could sustainably feed populations many times larger than Earth's current human inhabitants. But agriculture represents only the beginning of how we would exploit the ocean's resources. The seabed contains mineral wealth that makes terrestrial deposits look insignificant by comparison. Manganese nodules scattered across the abyssal plains contain nickel, copper, cobalt, and rare earth elements essential for electronics and renewable energy technologies. Massive sulfide deposits near hydrothermal vents contain gold, silver, zinc, and lead in concentrations that make them extraordinarily valuable. In our current world, mining these deposits is prohibitively expensive, requiring robotic systems operated remotely from ships on the surface, dealing with pressures that crush conventional equipment and darkness so complete that every operation requires artificial lighting. But in a world where humans can breathe underwater, where we can live and work at depth for extended periods, underwater mining becomes vastly more practical. Imagine mining towns on the ocean floor, communities of thousands living in pressurized habitats, venturing out in specialized suits that protect them from the crushing pressure of the deep ocean, while still allowing them to breathe the water around them. These would be frontier towns in the truest sense, rough and dangerous places where fortunes are made and lives are lost, where the work is brutal, but the pay is exceptional, attracting adventurers and desperates and visionaries who see opportunity in the darkness. The environmental consequences of this transformation would cut in two opposite directions simultaneously, creating tensions that would define politics and ethics for generations. On one hand, humanity's expansion into the ocean would represent an ecological catastrophe of unprecedented scale. We would bring our industry, our waste, our endless hunger for resources into ecosystems that have existed in relative isolation for millions of years. Coral reefs that took millennia to grow would be bulldozed to make room for underwater suburbs. Deep-sea environments, still largely unexplored in our current timeline, would be mapped, exploited, and exhausted within decades of becoming accessible. Species that evolved in the deep ocean's stable, unchanging environment would face extinction as their habitats are destroyed or altered beyond recognition. The ocean's role as a carbon sink, one of the critical regulators of Earth's climate, could be compromised as we disrupt ocean currents and alter the distribution of marine organisms that sequester carbon in their bodies and carry it to the deep sea when they die. Pollution would intensify as billions of humans begin generating waste directly into marine environments, overwhelming the ocean's capacity to process and dilute contaminants. But there's another possibility, perhaps equally likely, that paints a very different picture. When humans become native to the ocean, when we raise our children in underwater cities and build our lives around marine ecosystems, our relationship to those ecosystems necessarily changes. The ocean stops being an abstract concept, a distant environment that we can afford to ignore as long as our immediate surroundings seem fine. It becomes personal, intimate, impossible to ignore. If your neighborhood is built into a coral reef, you notice immediately when that reef starts dying. If your children play in kelp forests, you care deeply about keeping those forests healthy. If the fish you see every day during your commute start disappearing, you demand action to understand why and fix it. This direct connection could spark the most intensive environmental conservation movement in human history, with ocean stewardship becoming not a fringe political position, but a universal survival priority. We might see the development of ecological engineering on a massive scale, with humans actively managing ocean ecosystems to maintain their health and productivity. Coral reefs would be farmed and transplanted to restore damaged areas. Fish populations would be carefully monitored and protected. Pollution would be controlled with a strictness that seems impossible in our current world, because the consequences of failure would be visible every single day to everyone. The ocean might be healthier in a world full of amphibious humans than it is in our current world, where the ocean is out of sight and therefore out of mind for most of humanity. The scientific revolution that would accompany direct human access to the ocean would dwarf the insights gained from any previous era of exploration. Marine biology would transform from a specialty field requiring expensive research vessels and limited dive time into something every school child studies through direct observation. The ocean contains more biodiversity than all terrestrial environments combined. But in our current timeline, we've barely begun to catalog it, let alone understand it. The deep ocean in particular remains almost entirely unknown, with more humans having walked on the moon than having visited the deepest parts of the sea. But imagine marine biologists who can live at depth for months at a time, studying deep-sea organisms in their natural environment, observing behaviors and interactions that are impossible to see from the brief glimpses provided by submarine visits. We would discover thousands of new species every year, not just obscure variations on known forms, but entirely new categories of life, organisms that challenge our understanding of what's possible in biology. The pharmaceutical applications alone would be staggering as we tap into the chemical diversity of marine life, organisms that have evolved to produce compounds for defense, communication, and survival in an environment radically different from terrestrial conditions. The ocean's role in regulating Earth's climate would become far better understood as we study currents, temperature gradients, and biological processes from within rather than from above. We might discover that the ocean is even more critical to climate stability than we currently believe. Or we might find vulnerabilities we never suspected, zones where small changes could trigger cascading effects across the entire global system. Oceanography would merge with meteorology as we recognize that the boundary between ocean and atmosphere is far more permeable and interactive than previous models suggested. The great currents that carry heat from the tropics to the poles, moderating Earth's climate and making much of the planet habitable, would be mapped in exquisite detail, revealing dynamics that are invisible from surface observations. We would understand the ocean not as a static reservoir of water, but as a dynamic, living system with its own weather patterns, its own seasons, its own complex interconnections between physical, chemical, and biological processes. The military implications would be profound and deeply unsettling. Naval warfare has always been three-dimensional in theory, involving surface ships, submarines, and aircraft, but in practice, it's been constrained by human limitations, by the fact that most military personnel and equipment are designed for operation in air. An amphibious human civilization would conduct warfare in fully three-dimensional space, with soldiers who can operate at any depth for extended periods, with bases and fortifications built on the seabed, with weapons and tactics optimized for the unique properties of water. Submarine warfare would become exponentially more complex as submarines are hunted by human soldiers who can swim faster and more quietly than any mechanical system, who can approach targets from any direction, who can operate in shallow water and complex terrain where submarines are vulnerable and ineffective. The strategic importance of choke points like the Strait of Hormuz or the Malacca Strait would intensify as nations compete for control of underwater territories and resources. At the same time, the ocean's vastness might actually reduce conflict in some ways, offering so much space for expansion that territorial disputes become less common, at least temporarily, as nations focus on claiming and developing the enormous empty territories on the continental shelves and abyssal plains. Cultural evolution in amphibious human civilization would diverge in fascinating and unpredictable directions. Communities would specialize based on their chosen environments, with some remaining primarily terrestrial, venturing into water only occasionally, while others become almost entirely aquatic, maintaining only minimal connections to the land. Over generations, these communities would develop distinct identities, different values, and priorities shaped by their environments. Underwater communities might develop a more relaxed sense of personal space, since the three-dimensional nature of their environment means crowding is less of an issue. Or they might develop more rigid social hierarchies. Territorial behaviors evolve from the need to control resources in a more competitive environment. Language itself would evolve. With underwater communities, developing communication methods that work in water, combining sound, gesture, and perhaps bioluminescent signals in ways that terrestrial humans would find difficult to follow. Art and music would undergo radical transformations, taking advantage of water's unique properties. Dance in three dimensions would be fundamentally different from dance on a two-dimensional surface, allowing for movements and formations impossible in air. Music would incorporate the rich acoustic properties of water, the way sound travels farther and faster than in air, creating compositions that are designed to be heard while swimming through the space, with different instruments positioned at different depths to create layered, immersive soundscapes. The psychological impact of living in three-dimensional space would rewire human cognition in subtle but significant ways. Terrestrial humans have a strong sense of vertical orientation. We always know where down is, and our spatial memory is organized largely around horizontal navigation. Amphibious humans would develop spatial reasoning that treats all three dimensions equally, navigating by landmarks that might be above, below, or to any side, remembering locations in a truly three-dimensional mental map. This enhanced spatial reasoning might have spillover effects into mathematics and physics, making certain abstract concepts more intuitive. The experience of neutral buoyancy, of floating weightless in water, would become so familiar that gravity itself would feel like an occasional limitation rather than a fundamental constraint. Children would grow up with an intuitive understanding of fluid dynamics, learning to read currents and predict flows the way terrestrial children learn to judge distances and heights. The phenomenology of underwater existence, the quality of light filtering down from above, the muffled quality of sounds, the constant gentle pressure of water on all sides, would shape consciousness in ways that terrestrial humans could barely comprehend, creating a fundamentally different lived experience of reality. Sports and recreation would explode with possibilities that seem like pure fantasy from our current perspective. Imagine Olympic events held in open ocean, with athletes racing through three-dimensional courses that spiral down into the depths before arcing back toward the surface, navigating by instinct and experience through obstacle courses that change with the currents. Team sports would incorporate the vertical dimension in ways that create entirely new strategic possibilities, with players able to pass above or below opponents, with goals that might be positioned at any depth. Extreme sports would reach new levels of danger and excitement as athletes push the limits of how deep and how fast humans can go. Free diving to abyssal depths, or riding ocean currents like surfers ride waves, except these currents would carry them for miles at speeds no terrestrial human could match. Tourism would transform into something unrecognizable, with travelers swimming across entire oceans following whale migrations, or spending months exploring the mid-Atlantic ridge, or visiting the strange ecosystems around hydrothermal vents where life exists without any connection to sunlight. The concept of wilderness would expand to include the vast empty spaces of the open ocean, areas far from any human settlement where you can swim for days without seeing another person, alone with the currents and the marine life and the deep blue infinity stretching in all directions. But perhaps the most profound shift would be philosophical, a transformation in how amphibious humans understand their place in the universe. For all of human history, we've been exceptional among animals, the one species that used intelligence to overcome physical limitations and dominate virtually every environment on land. But the ocean remained beyond our reach, a constant reminder that for all our cleverness, we were still constrained by biology, still fundamentally limited creatures despite our technology and civilization. This limitation has shaped human culture in countless ways, creating a sense of boundaries, of frontiers that mark the edge of human possibility. The ocean has always been the ultimate symbol of the unknown, the untamed, the places where humans don't belong. Gaining the ability to breathe underwater would shatter that symbolism, removing one of the last great constraints on human expansion. This might breed a dangerous hubris, a sense that nothing remains beyond our capacity to conquer and colonize, that the universe itself is simply waiting for us to claim it. This overconfidence could lead to reckless exploitation, to environmental catastrophes, to a kind of cosmic arrogance that assumes human desires and human needs should take precedence over all other considerations. Yet there's another possible outcome, perhaps more likely, certainly more hopeful. Living in the ocean might teach humility in ways that living on land never could. Land is static, predictable, controllable. We can level mountains, drain swamps, turn forests into farmland. We can remake terrestrial environments to suit our preferences, and for the most part, those environments stay remade. The ocean is different. The ocean is powerful in ways that dwarf human capability, with currents that can sweep away the strongest swimmer, with storms that can destroy any structure, with depths so profound that human technology still struggles to reach them. You can't control the ocean the way you can control land. You can only adapt to it, work with it, understand that you're a guest in an environment that existed long before humans and will continue long after we're gone. This recognition might foster a different kind of relationship between humans and nature, one based not on domination, but on coexistence, on the understanding that we're part of a larger system rather than masters of it. Living underwater, being surrounded constantly by the ocean's immensity and power, might create humans who are more humble, more respectful, more aware of their own smallness in the grand scheme of things. And so we return to that moment, standing once again at the ocean's edge as the sun sets and the sky darkens and the first stars begin to appear. The waves roll in with their eternal rhythm, older than humanity, older than mammals, older than anything that walks on land. For millions of years, our ancestors stood at this same boundary, looking out at the water with longing and fear, knowing that beyond the shallows lay a world they could never truly know. But in this imagined future, in this world where human lungs can breathe water as easily as air, that boundary has dissolved. The ocean is no longer separate from human civilization, no longer a frontier that marks the limit of human habitat. It's home, as familiar as any city street or mountain trail, a three-dimensional wilderness that we navigate with the same confidence that our ancestors walked the African savanna. The transformation from terrestrial to amphibious wouldn't just change where humans live, or how we gather food, or what technologies we develop. It would change what it means to be human, altering our psychology, our culture, our relationship with the natural world in ways both beautiful and terrifying. We would become creatures of two worlds, equally comfortable in air and water, no longer fully land animals, but not quite fish either. Something new, something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. And in that transformation, we would confront the deepest questions about human nature. about whether we're defined by our biology or by our choices, about whether there are any limits to human adaptability, about what we're willing to sacrifice and what we're determined to preserve as we continue the endless human project of remaking ourselves and remaking our world. The answer, like the ocean itself, remains vast and dark and full of mysteries we're only beginning to imagine, waiting somewhere in the depths, calling us home.